Joining us now from Jerusalem, NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. Richard, what's the latest there on the ground, including Israel's response to these calls for a humanitarian pause so some of that aid can get into Gaza?
So that is going to be top of the agenda, it seems, during the visit by Secretary Blinken. He's arrived, and effectively he is pushing to slow this war down. Call it a pause, call it a ceasefire. The United States isn't calling it a ceasefire, but an effort to slow down the fighting so that we don't enter into a cycle of violence that we cannot get out of, that Israel cannot get out of, that the United States is drawn into. And the timing is critical. So Israeli troops, according to the military, have now encircled Gaza City. Gaza City is the most densely part of the Gaza Strip. It was home at one stage to 800,000 people. It's unclear how many are still in Gaza City, but still quite a few people in there. They're already in street-to-street fighting. Israel is already taking casualties. There are many, many Palestinian deaths every single day. According to the health ministry, the number has surpassed 9,000. Israel has not outlined any clear long-term plan, any clear exit strategy. And now we have these looming threats from the region, increased attacks by Iran proxies, this speech coming from the leader of Hezbollah later today. So it seems that the Secretary of State is trying to slow it down, perhaps for cooler heads to emerge and to find potentially a way out of this before there is no way out of this.
So, Richard, I know Hezbollah has regretted in the past some incursions from the north with Israel. I'm curious if the expectation in Israel and around the Middle East is that actually the leader today will announce that they are going to be opening up a new front from the north, or if they're simply going to express solidarity with their brothers in Hamas.
The latter. People do not expect that he is going to make an announcement and then as soon as the address is done, there will be rocket fire raining down on Israel. There could be some attacks because there have already been attacks in the last several weeks since this war has begun. But we do not expect that as soon as he makes his announcement, we will have a new, wider war all across the Middle East. The thinking from Hamas, as best we can understand, and from Hezbollah and from Hamas, is that Hamas is happy to drag Israel into a long-term guerrilla war in Gaza. They are hoping that this will be another Vietnam or another Somalia for Israel. And if Israel is willing to take this bait, go into Gaza, lose troops, then the thinking from Hezbollah is it will wait. It will allow Israel to get sucked into a quagmire in the Middle East, potentially dragging in the United States, and then it could attack at a later stage. So we are as I said, we are in a very critical phase where Israel is going deeper and deeper into the Gaza Strip, and Hamas seems very happy to pull Israel into this fight, regardless of the consequences for the people of the Gaza Strip, no matter how many people are losing their lives in Gaza, and thousands of people are dying in Gaza, no matter who is counting the numbers. It's quite obvious.
Richard, obviously there has been a split among Israelis through the years about a group of Israelis who are more hardcore on their belief that there doesn't need to be a two-state solution, that Israel needs to be as aggressive as they can, starting up settlements in the West Bank. But obviously, there have been a large number of Israelis who also believe that they need to move towards a two-state solution. Tragically, many of the people who were slaughtered on October the 7th were some of those people who thought that that peace needed to be made with the Palestinians. I'm curious, for that faction, the more moderate wing in Israel, are they talking about the possibility of pulling back, or does Israel, and it would be understandable if they did, are Israeli politicians where our politicians were on, say, September 12th, 2001?
I think you're closer to the latter. It is more that politicians are where the United States was on September 12th. This government was already a very right-wing government before this attack happened. There were protests on the street. The sort of more liberal left wings Israelis were on the street protesting against the government, protesting against Netanyahu because he had formed a coalition with some of the most extreme elements in Israeli society. So that government, which had Netanyahu and these extreme elements, and many said he was pandering to the extreme elements, trying to change laws in society, empowering extremist settlers in the West Bank, provoking Palestinians. That was the situation we were in at the beginning of the conflict. Now, that government, although it is expanded, including some other members to form a war cabinet, is at war. And many people in Israel are determined to go to war. And if you remember the days after 9/11, there was a movement in the United States where people were angry. They were outraged. They were attacking Muslims on the street. They were attacking Sikhs because they thought they were Muslims on the street. There was a real anger. And what did they end up doing? They ended up invading Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, breaking the country and then spending years trying to put it back together. So there are voices emerging saying, slow down, be careful what you do. Don't go into a war without a long-term plan. And ultimately, that debate is happening. But while that debate is happening, the fighting is still underway. And Netanyahu is refusing any kind of ceasefire. And I think it's also important not to get too hung up on the terminology. What is a pause? What is a ceasefire? To a degree, they're the same thing. The practicality is they're the same thing. You stop fighting. But the reason the United States says it can never have a ceasefire with Hamas, or Israel says it can never have a ceasefire with Hamas, is it dignifies the group too much. Going back to 9/11, the United States could never say it will have a ceasefire with Al-Qaeda. We would never have a ceasefire with ISIS because the group is evil and the fight against those will go on forever. But you could have a tactical humanitarian pause with Al-Qaeda in order to freeze some hostages or do some practical deal. But you could never give up on the principle of destroying that evil, the principle of removing them from power in the long term. So I think there is a bit of language here because you don't want to dignify the group. You don't want to say we're going to go into a written agreement with a group that is declared evil, a group that is holding hostages, that has murdered children, babies, a group that is proven its brutality. But if they can have some sort of pauses, cooler heads to prevail, work to get some hostages out, and maybe come up with what is the long-term strategy? Who is going to govern who is going to govern the Gaza Strip once Hamas is disarmed, if that day comes?
Right. Well, and if that day comes, Richard, finally, final question has to do with the West Bank. You were in Ramallah with us a couple of weeks ago. We were talking to you from there. Violence has sprung up between those extremist settlers and Palestinians being attacked on the West Bank. President Biden even spoke of that in a joint press conference with the Australian Prime Minister. Is there already an understanding that even if Israel achieves its goals of disarming Hamas in Gaza, that the extremist settlers on the West Bank are going to cause a hell of a problem in moving toward that two-state solution?
Oh, they already are. Since this war has begun, according to human rights groups, according to our own reporting, according to a new report from the United Nations, violence by extremist settlers has increased significantly since the October 7th massacre by Hamas. We saw some of it ourselves yesterday in multiple locations in the West Bank where Palestinians who are living there, moderate. We met an elderly couple, Christian couple. They were on their land picking olives, and a group of extremist settlers came over in order to carry out revenge and started beating them up and beat up an elderly couple and then went back to their settlement unprovoked and no repercussions. And this kind of thing is happening all the time, according to multiple human rights groups. And that is only inflaming tensions. It is inflaming tensions. One Palestinian activist from the Palestinian Authority, who was beaten and humiliated, told me it's like a balloon. You push pressure, you keep inflating it, inflating it, inflating it, and one day it is going to explode. And he said that there is this concern that if that pressure from the settler violence continues, you're going to have an explosion of violence in the West Bank and here in Jerusalem, on top of the ongoing war against Hamas in Gaza.
Just so everybody who's watching knows why we're talking about this right now, along with what's happening in Gaza, is because what's been happening on the West Bank has shaped Israeli politics so much. And extremists on the far right have played such a heavy hand in Netanyahu remaining in power that many secular Jews, and if you could speak to this, Richard, I know you've heard it there a lot. Many secular Jews are enraged by the fact that the government has paid so much attention to these extremists and even let some of them into the government. And what really angers the secular Jews there are, they make the most demands, but are contemptuous of the military.
So people have to understand. So there's the Gaza Strip in the south, which is run by Hamas. Hamas is both a terrorist organization, has a military wing, but it also has a government function in that it governs the Gaza Strip. And right now, Israel is in a war to remove Hamas and destroy Hamas in Gaza. In the West Bank, which is not connected to Gaza, there is the Palestinian Authority, a far more moderate government that Israel hopes will become the government for both the West Bank and Gaza. It's unclear if that's going to happen, but that's the idea. Within the West Bank, this separate territory, there are extremist settlers. The extremist settlers live in communities, and often, particularly in these days, in this climate of rage, they are leaving their settlements and attacking the Palestinians around them. The government of Israeli Netanyahu, or Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, formed a coalition with many of these settler leaders in order to keep himself in power, in order to form a government so he could continue to govern this country and stay in power. He's been a dominant political figure for the last 20 years. And yes, secular Israelis were saying, you are pandering to the extreme right. You are giving these people too much power, and now that government is at war. And these deep fissures in society are emerging. Going back to what we were saying initially, which is why the timing is so critical for Secretary Blinken's visit right now. The U.S. Israeli troops have encircled Gaza City, which they're already in street fighting. They could enter into a much, much more dangerous phase of street fighting in the coming days in Gaza City. The settlers who were empowered by Netanyahu, who are helping him stay in power, are acting in ways that are far more emboldened than they have been in the past, according to human rights groups and our own reporting. And the Israeli secular society that was opposed to Netanyahu, opposed to these politics right now, are very concerned about what is happening here, very concerned that this country is going down a path that it will be difficult to recover from.